Hi, okay, so this is the next lecture about Genderlect, that is the differences between male and female speech styles and or if they exist at all. So we talked about the deficit model last time. Now we're going to talk about what's called the dominance model. So this came after the deficit approach associated with Robin Lakoff and wanted to talk about men and women's language differently. And offered an alternative way to explain if and why there are differences between male and female speech styles. And what's interesting about the dominance model is the linguists involved were seeking to investigate how men dominate women in conversation rather than blaming women for being weak speakers, which is what you can see is happening with Robin Lakoff and the deficit model. So in order to investigate how men dominate women in conversation, it was sort of necessary to look at mixed gender talk, unsurprisingly. And these are some of the features that these linguists chose to study on. So you might need to remind yourself a little bit of discourse analysis that we did for spoken mode in the first term, if you can't remember exactly what these terms refer to. So these are the features of discourse, i.e. conversation, that these people focused on. Interruptions and overlapping speech. Those can be seen as ways to dominate a conversation. Obviously, an interruption is an attempt to take the turn from another speaker. So you take a turn while they're speaking, you interrupt them and you start to speak. Another aspect that would reveal dominance is who gets to control what topics are introduced, what topics are taken up, and keep a topic going, because that kind of relies on a sort of cooperation to keep a topic going in conversation. Another thing that might demonstrate who's most dominant in a conversation is the number of turns a speaker has. You would imagine that would be a dominant speaker, but also the length of your turn. So you may not have many turns, but when you get your turn, you may speak for a great deal of time. So that would indicate who is being more dominant. It's also worth looking at the use of minimal response. Now, minimal response sounds uncooperative, but actually it's one of the most important features of helping someone keep speaking. So minimal response is when one speaker has their turn and they're speaking, but when they pause, the people they're speaking to say things like, yeah, uh-huh, make a noise into that pause that shows they're listening. And that encourages the speaker to keep speaking. And what we call delayed minimal response is when the person pauses and the supposed listener doesn't make that or leaves a gap longer than is normal to give the minimal response. And the effect of that is to undermine the speaker because it sounds like people aren't interested in what you're saying. And I know it sounds weird to say in a dominance model, but one of the ways that you can stop women speaking, if we're talking about gender, is by saying nothing when they speak. Okay, so we'll see some of these in actual research studies now. Okay, we're going to talk about 3 research studies into this, all of them American, which may or may not make a difference to how we feel about this. So Zimmerman and West, 2 linguists in the University of California, quite a small sample. They recorded and transcribed 11 mixed gender conversations. And they found lots of things, but you know, we want to think of things that we can remember in the exam, things that, you know, seem to prove their point. So in their data, one of the key findings was, you can say from their data that men interrupt more than women. Okay, they found in their 11 mixed gender conversations, male speakers interrupted other speakers 46 times, female speakers interrupted other speakers only twice. Okay, if you want to read the entire study, there's a link to it there. And another person who did research into this is Pamela Fishman. She didn't do university students and lecturers, she did couples, and only 3 couples. You might think that's a fairly small sample, but what you've got to think about in research is, do you want to have lots and lots of different participants, or do you want to have lots of really rich data? So she only had 3 couples, but she had a lot of data. She did a lot of recordings. So what she found, women asked 3 times as many questions as men. Questions are a way to try and bring someone else into a conversation. So she saw questions as trying to engage and stimulate conversation, and women were doing that work, if you want to call it work. Minimal responses were used supportively by women to develop topics when another person was speaking, but she found the male speakers much more likely to withhold or delay minimal response to curtail the topic. And given that she's only talking about one man talking to one woman, the effect of that is that the woman supported the man's topics, so his talking went on a lot longer, but the man didn't necessarily support the woman's topics, which effectively gives her less power in the conversation and less space to speak. Women used more attention getters to start conversations or to restart conversations after delayed response. And she found that men's topics were always successful, whereas the women's topics were often not taken up. So that would be ways in which the male speakers dominated and the female speakers were pushed into this supportive, weaker role in the conversation. And then we have DeFrancisco from 1992, similar to Fishman. She had 7 couples, 7 US couples at home. And when I say couples, men and women couples. She found that men were relatively silent and that their behaviours silenced women. She said the most common turn-taking violation was no response to an initiation. Particularly, she found the male halves of these couples did that. So a turn-taking violation is when you don't follow what's expected in what we call adjacency pairs. So if you remember when we did discourse analysis, conversation is built up of these pairs: initiation, response. The initiation can be a question, it can be a statement, it could be a greeting, and then the person you say that to responds, and that is normal behaviour. If someone doesn't respond, we call that a violation. So if I met you in the corridor and I said good morning and you didn't say good morning, that would be a turn-taking violation. If I said how are you today and you didn't reply to my question, that would be a turn-taking violation. And if I said I forgot my badge today and you didn't say anything in response, that would still be a violation. Even though what I said was a statement, it's still an initiation, and people do expect something back. She found that women worked harder to maintain interaction, but were less successful in their attempts. So this is what we saw in the earlier research: starting conversation topics, not having them taken up. And she coined this rather memorable phrase that women do the conversational shit work, which, you know, you can quote her in the exam. It's not that academic sounding, but it's quite a good image of this idea that women are working a lot harder to keep conversations going, but not having their topics taken up, not being dominant in these conversations. She found that no responses accounted for 45% of all the turn-taking violations, but she also found interruptions were the second most common violation. And that would seem to support that first thing we talked about for Zimmerman and West, that the men interrupting the women more. Okay, that is the end of talking about the dominance model. Okay, so I'm going to stop that, and in the next class we're going to talk about difference.